They put an old rifle in his hands and gave those polite little smiles, the kind that say they already made up their minds. They figured he would miss. And he did, on the first shot. Just barely. I heard a young instructor lean in and mutter, "Let's not burn through too much ammunition." But when he pulled the trigger the second time, the whole range went dead quiet. Nobody there knew who he really was. Not until the base commander stepped forward and said, "Clear as day. That man still holds the longest-standing record we have on this base." Then he looked around at everyone watching and added, "If you believe real skill does not disappear with age, and that some veterans still have stories worth listening to, subscribe and stay with us. This one matters." That morning at Fort Redfield started out cool and calm. Fort Redfield is a mid-sized Army training post in the Midwest, the kind of place where most days feel slow and predictable. But that day was different. The firing range was alive with noise and movement. New recruits stood in neat lines, helmets sitting a little crooked, rifles shining with fresh oil. They were all there for the same reason, the quarterly marksmanship test. Off to the side, a beat-up Ford pickup crawled along the gravel road and came to a stop. The driver's door opened real slow, and an old man climbed out. His name was Frank Miller, though most folks called him Frank. He had on a worn windbreaker over a faded flannel shirt, and the way his left boot dragged just a bit told you he walked with a limp. A simple canvas bag hung from his shoulder. Nothing official, just old and used, like it had been with him a long time. His grandson, Private Caleb Miller, broke from the line and jogged over. "Grandpa, you actually came," he whispered, eyes wide and excited. Frank smiled, small but warm. "Wouldn't miss it, Caleb. Figured I would come watch you boys show what you got." One of the younger recruits glanced over and nudged his buddy. "Hey, who's the old man?" Caleb answered, "That's my grandpa. He used to shoot back when—" But the kid was already looking away, not really interested. Most of the instructors did not pay Frank much attention at first. Finally, one of them, Sergeant Nolan Reeves, walked over carrying a plastic chair. "You're welcome to sit and watch, sir," he said, keeping his voice respectful. "Just stay behind the firing line. It gets pretty loud out here." Frank nodded. "That's fine." But before he sat down, he reached into his canvas bag. Inside was a rifle wrapped in cloth. It was long, old, and clearly well used, though it had been cleaned and cared for. He slid the cloth back and ran his hand along the barrel, slow and gentle, like he was saying hello to an old friend. Nobody seemed to notice. Not yet. When Sergeant Nolan Reeves finally saw the rifle, he let out a short laugh. "Didn't think anyone still shot those old Woodstock-style rifles," he said, shaking his head. "That thing belongs in a museum, not on a range." Frank just nodded again. "She still does her job, as long as my hands do theirs." Caleb shifted his feet, a little uneasy. He really did shoot back in the day. He was pretty good, actually. Nolan Reeves barely looked up as he scanned the recruits. "Well," he said, "we have a spare target down at Lane 7. If he wants to fire a couple rounds, just for fun." The way he said, "for fun," made it sound like a joke nobody bothered laughing at. Frank walked toward Lane 7, moving slower than the young men around him. He adjusted his glasses, rolled his shoulders back as best he could, and planted his feet. His left knee shook a little. A few nearby recruits tried hard not to stare, but they could not help themselves. I heard one of the kids behind me whisper, "No way he can even keep that barrel steady." Another one snorted and said, "Someone better call range control and get a medic ready." If Frank heard them, he never showed it. And if he did hear them, I think he just let the words pass right through him. He brought the rifle up slow, like time was not pushing him at all. He closed one eye, drew in a long breath, and held it. Then the rifle cracked. The shot missed. Clean miss. There was a short pause, followed by a few quiet laughs that tried to hide themselves. Sergeant Nolan Reeves clapped his hands once, sharp. "All right," he said, "let's not waste ammunition." Frank's voice came back soft, but steady. "One more." Nolan Reeves turned around, eyebrows lifting. "Sir, maybe it would be better if we—" "One more," Frank said again, locking eyes with him. He did not raise his voice. He did not sound angry, but something in the way he said it made the whole line freeze. Caleb stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "He's got this." Nolan Reeves looked at the other instructors, then gave a slow nod. "Fine. One more round." Frank settled himself again. This time, he did not rush a thing. He rubbed his thumb along the wooden stock like he was pulling a memory out of it. Then he adjusted his grip, careful and exact. The wind died down. People behind him kept whispering, but none of it reached him. All he followed was his breathing. In, out, calm. When he raised the rifle again, there was no shake in it now. Just stillness, the kind that feels heavy. His finger tightened on the trigger. Bang. The sound rolled down the range and then vanished. After that, there was nothing. No laughter, no talking, just silence. Someone near the back finally said, barely loud enough to hear, "Was that a hit?" Sergeant Nolan Reeves bent over the spotting scope and squinted. He stayed there longer than before. Then he reached up and slowly turned the dial, zooming in as far as it would go. He leaned back from the scope, his face drained of color. Caleb stepped closer. "Sergeant?" Nolan Reeves did not answer. He simply waved another instructor over and pointed at the scope. One by one, they took turns looking. Nobody cracked a joke this time. Nobody smiled. A younger recruit stepped forward and raised his binoculars. "No way," he whispered. Down at the far end, the silhouette target fluttered in the breeze. The center was split clean through. Not chipped, not torn wide. Split straight down the middle, so precise it looked like a blade had cut it from edge to edge. One round. Dead center. Perfect. Frank lowered the rifle like he had just finished a simple chore. No grin, no pride showing. Nothing flashy. He turned to Caleb and said, quiet and plain, "That'll do." The kid with the binoculars shook his head. "He didn't even brace." Another voice muttered, stunned, "I did not think he could even lift that rifle right." Caleb broke into a wide grin, the kind you cannot hide. You could see the pride pushing up in his chest. "He doesn't need to brace," he said quietly. "He built that stance back in 1972. Another recruit leaned toward his buddy and whispered, "Wait, what did he say his name was?" Sergeant Nolan Reeves finally cleared his throat. "Frank Miller." The silence that followed grew heavier, but not uncomfortable. It felt respectful, like everyone suddenly knew they were standing inside something important. A voice from the back spoke up. "You do not think that is the Frank Miller from Fort Liberty Ridge, do you?" Nolan Reeves did not answer. He did not need to. Deep down, he already knew. One soldier took off jogging toward the main office without anyone telling him to. A few minutes later, old personnel files were being pulled up from a computer system that looked like it had not been touched in years. Frank was already sitting back down. He eased himself into the chair and carefully slid the rifle into its canvas sleeve. Not to hide it, just to let it rest. He glanced at Caleb and gave him a small nod, the kind a man gives when he has finished something. Not for himself, but so someone else could see it done. The rest of us just stood there, staring at that torn bullseye like it was more than a clean shot. And in that moment, it was. The name, Frank Miller, moved through the crowd like a slow wave. Some people shrugged, not recognizing it. Then Master Sergeant Robert Hale froze mid-step. He was older, gray creeping in at the temples, half retired already. He turned around slowly. "Miller, Fort Liberty Ridge," he said. 1987, right?" Nolan Reeves nodded. "He said he shot there." Robert Hale's eyes narrowed. "Yeah, I know. But why?" He did not wait for an answer. He walked straight to the fire control center at the edge of the range. Inside, the office was tight and cluttered. Old binders stacked on shelves. dusty plaques on the walls, a computer that looked like it belonged in a museum. Robert Hale sat down and typed slow, one finger at a time. Miller, Frank. Search result found. He clicked it. Up came a scanned record, pulled from paper. The photo showed a younger man, lean and sunburned, standing next to a paper target split perfectly through the center. Fort Liberty Ridge Marksmanship record, 1987. Longest-standing bullseye shot under open range conditions. Unbroken. Robert Hale blinked. The date at the bottom read August 4th, 1987. Exactly 36 years ago that week. He printed the page and walked back outside, holding the paper like it weighed 10 pounds. By the time he returned to the range, a black sport utility vehicle had rolled into the service access lot. Government plates. Small flag decal on the side. Colonel Thomas Grayson, the base commander, stepped out. He did not speak right away. He walked the length of the range, slow and steady, until he stopped in front of the old man sitting in the chair. Frank did not stand. He just looked up. The colonel took off his hat and held it against his chest. "Sir," he said quietly, "we have a plaque inside the range office. It has been hanging there for 36 years. He paused. "Your name is on it." Some of us made a habit of reading that plaque once a year. Most people did it out of routine. Almost nobody ever wondered if the man behind the name was still breathing, still walking around this world. Frank gave a small nod. "I didn't come here for clapping," he said. "I know," Colonel Whitmore answered, "but what you did out there today was not chance. That was history showing itself." After that, you could feel the shift. The recruits stood a little taller, like their spines had been pulled straight. The instructors eased back, giving space without being told. And Caleb. Caleb looked at his grandfather in a new way. Not just proud, something deeper. The kind of pride you feel when you realize your last name carries weight you never understood before. Frank rested his hand on Caleb's shoulder. "I trained a lot of soldiers once," he said. "Figured maybe it was time I came and watched one instead." Later that afternoon, when the sun started dropping behind the trees, a group of younger soldiers gathered in the lounge. The story had already raced across the base. A retired shooter had shown up, picked up a rifle, and reminded everyone he still had not lost his touch. Inside the control office, Caleb sat next to his grandfather. The old rifle lay across Frank's knees like it belonged there. "You never told me," Caleb said quietly. Frank stared out the window for a long moment. There wasn't much to say. Caleb shook his head. "You held a base record for 36 years. They said you trained half the men who went through sniper school. People talk about you like you were one of the best to ever pass through Fort Liberty Ridge." Frank shrugged, slow and easy. "Records wear out. Medals get shoved in boxes. What sticks is who you show up for when nobody's watching." Caleb opened the canvas bag again. He moved past the cleaning rag and the old ear protection. At the bottom, his fingers found a worn leather folder. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, a faded certificate, and a photograph. The photo showed a young Frank Miller kneeling beside two soldiers. One was a young lieutenant named Aaron. The other sat in a wheelchair, smiling and giving a crooked half salute. The headline read, "Army Sharpshooter pulls 3 from ambush, refuses medal." "I found this online a few years ago," Caleb said. "I just never knew it was you." Frank leaned forward and traced the edge of the picture with his thumb. "Those boys never made it home," he said quietly. "The only reason that story ever got printed was because Aaron lived long enough to tell it." Caleb studied him for a moment. "Why did you ever stop shooting?" Frank did not answer right away. He sat there, still as stone, like he was sorting through a long line of memories. Finally, he spoke. "After that day, it stopped feeling like a talent. It started feeling like weight I had to carry. So I stepped back. I taught others instead, stayed behind the line and let the young men step forward." Caleb did not say a word. he just nodded. The kind of nod that means, I hear you, I understand, and I will carry this with me. Outside, a handful of recruits had formed a quiet line near the entrance. They were not there for drills or orders. They were there to shake his hand. One at a time, they stepped up. No cheering, no fuss, just simple thanks. Thank you, sir. Frank returned each greeting with a nod of his own. He never told them about the ambushes, the night operations, or the medals that never showed up. He just sat there with a calm dignity that seemed to say, I never needed to be remembered. I just wanted what I did to matter. The next morning, the range was silent. No training scheduled, no shouting, only the wind moving through the trees. Frank showed up early. Nobody asked him to. He came because it felt right. He carried only a thermos of coffee, his cap tucked under his arm. At the far end of the range, Caleb was already waiting. 4 recruits stood behind him, the same ones who had laughed 2 days earlier. Now they held fresh targets and looked uneasy, not because they feared discipline, but because they did not want to let anyone down. Private Miller, Frank called out. These boys any good? Caleb smiled. Better than they were, still plenty to learn. Frank nodded. Good, keep them steady. He stayed back the whole morning. He did not fire a single round. He did not give a speech. But every now and then, Caleb glanced over his shoulder just to be sure. Frank was always watching. When the recruits finally packed up, Sergeant Nolan Reeves walked over. His voice was low. I owe you an apology. I thought you were just someone visiting for the day. I did not realize I was standing in front of the reason half our training manuals even exist. Frank took his hand and shook it. We all start somewhere, Sergeant, Frank said calmly. What counts is how we finish. Nolan Reeves nodded. That shot of yours, he said. We framed it. The target. It's going up in the main office, right next to the 1987 plaque. Frank lifted an eyebrow. You still had that old plaque? Nolan Reeves smiled. We do now. As Frank was heading out, Caleb hurried to catch up with him. They're going to talk about you now, he said. Everyone. You'll be remembered. Frank took a slow sip from his thermos and looked out across the quiet range. I'm not worried about being remembered, he said. I'm just glad somebody knows the story now. He pulled his worn cap down over his head and walked back toward his truck. Caleb stayed where he was for a few seconds, watching him go, because sometimes a legacy does not need statues or speeches. Sometimes it only takes one clean shot and someone willing to stand there and witness it. 3 days later, a new frame appeared on the wall inside the range's main office. It hung beside an old plaque that had been collecting dust for decades. Inside the frame was the target from Frank Miller's second shot, still split clean down the middle, still perfect. Below it, a small brass plate read, Frank Miller, Fort Liberty Ridge, 1987. Returned in 2023. Still precise, still humble. Most people walked past it without noticing, but the ones who understood stopped for a moment. In the corner of the office, a retired Marine leaned close and whispered, He missed once. Then he smiled. That's what discipline really looks like. Outside, Caleb found his grandfather sitting alone on a bench beneath the old flagpole. A soft breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Frank's cane rested beside him, untouched. In his hands were only a folded paper napkin and a fresh cup of black coffee. You come back to fire again? Caleb asked. Fire, Frank repeated, shaking his head. No, just came to hear it. Hear what? Frank tilted his head toward the range where another group of recruits was lining up, the distant sounds drifting across the field. They sat together for a long while, not saying much. Because some stories do not need to be told twice, and some legacies do not need noise. They just need silence, respect, and a single bullet that found its mark even after 20 years. If someone in your life ever showed quiet strength, share this story with them. And if you believe dignity never retires, subscribe.